Hey everybody, welcome to the Planetary Phasal Relationship class. I'm Sarah Dehaven and I'll be teaching you all about this technique. Quick thanks to Stormy Grace for inviting me for this year's YouTube Academy. I am super excited to share this technique with you all. It's not an overly utilized technique, but it's super useful. So if you find it to be your jam, then it's going to lend a lot of insight into your chart reading for sure. So let's jump right in. So here are the lesson chapters. We're going to do a bit of an introduction, describe the main mechanisms of this process, this technique, and then we'll go into the phases to explain how they work from the lens of planetary phasal relationships specifically. So yes, you may have heard of phasal relationships before. If you have familiarity with lunation cycles, moon phases, then you're already in a great position for this class, because what this is it's in a sense a derivative of the lunation cycle technique, but instead we apply the technique rather than to the sun and the moon only. We apply this technique to all planetary pairs in the chart, and that's not just planets. We can also apply this technique to angles. So your ascendant, your descendant, your midheaven, your IC, you can apply this technique to that too. So that's really useful if you want to understand maybe how your ascendant is relating to your Mars. Just as one example, you can actually see what the dynamic of the relationship is from another angle using, no pun intended, using planetary phases. You can use it on asteroids, of course, and even theoretical points. So I have it pointed out here, like the south node of the moon. You can use this technique on that. And here I'm also indicating Black Moon Lilith, which you can most certainly apply this technique to. I'm just going to see if I can put on, great, I got my laser pointer. Sweet, because everyone loves the laser pointer. All right. So yes, essentially, if you want to know, can I apply this technique, planetary phases? All you need to know is, does the point have a zodiac sign and a degree? If it does, then that means that you can apply planetary phases to it and get into a depth that is, it just opens up the chart. I mean, yes, you can look at aspects, you can look at the signs and their relationship dynamic between two planets, those the signs like say Venus and Leo and Mars and Capricorn, how they would get along in a chart. You can look at the modality, is it fixed, cardinal, or mutable? You can look at the degree, the decan, so many things, the house that they're positioned in. And you can also look at the planetary phase. So we'll talk a bit more about that. Of course, we're going to go more in depth, but before that, let's continue on with the slides here. So yeah, dividing the wheel into phases. There's many ways you can do this. We're going to be using the 8-phase model today, which is a derivation of the lunation cycle model. So we're going to divide the wheel into 45-degree segments. That's 8 phases, but you can do it by 12 phases, which is 30-degree segments. That's Dane Rudyard's thing. He has a book called Astrological Aspects, a Process-Oriented Approach that goes into planetary phases using 12 phases, literally the zodiacal model, we could say. And if you're into this, if you enjoy this class, there's other ways that you can layer onto your chart phases to expand and deepen your interpretation. For instance, down here, I've got, you can divide it by 3s. So you could divide it by the modality, for instance, by 3, or by 4s. You could divide it that way, or even 27 based on like lunar mansions and these kinds of things. I'm not too familiar with that, but I have heard in passing, word on the street is you can read planets by that model as well. So many ways to expand your interpretation. Of course, like I said, we're going to be focusing on the 8-phase model today. And yeah, so that's where we're going. Here's just a graphic to demonstrate what it would look like, the 12-phase model. You may be familiar with this. It's the chart wheel. And that's literally how the 12-phase model works. Each phase is analogous to the natural zodiac, as you can see here, like phase 1 is akin to Aries, phase 12 is akin to Pisces, and so on throughout the whole wheel, right? The 8 phases, again, is a derivative of the lunation model. So that is the 360-degree wheel divided into 45-degree segments, which we can see here, like new phase, crescent phase, first quarter phase, gibbous, full, disseminating, last quarter, and balsamic. And you may have different words that you have heard with regard to these phases. Some people say last quarter phase is third quarter phase, for instance. So if you're not familiar with that, we'll be using this model in this class. Hopefully it won't be too confusing. All right, so the value of phasal relationships and how they differ from aspects. This is useful, so we'll go through this too. So phases are foundational. They lay a foundation. They show the stage of development of the relationship between two archetypes of consciousness / experience, which we call planets or points, right? They show the stage of development between these two archetypes of consciousness / experience during the cycle depicted within the chart. So much like the moon phase depicts the development of the emotional and actualizing sides of a person or population, that's how we would use planetary phases. Like, you know, like a full, when the full moon comes out, one of the, you know, you just hear people say, oh yeah, like, you know, the people's emotions are on full display during a full moon. And as astrologers, we know that all too well, the mechanics behind that, but that's even, we could say maybe like an axiom or common knowledge in society generally, that during a full moon, people are a little more riled. It's because the full light of the sun is being reflected by the moon. If we take two planets in full phase, we can see similar dynamics, but from the perspective of the archetypes that are in relation to each other, which we'll get deeper into as we progress through today's class to explain that. Phases also reveal how two planets or points are communicating from the aforementioned in number 1, even when there's no visible aspect between the two. So this is very valuable. Like I was saying, in addition to reading two planets and interpreting or synthesizing them from a perspective of maybe modality or polarity or element or sign or even house placement, the phases can lend even more insight into, well, what's the dynamic between the relationship based on the degree of distance between the two of them. Some say, like when I say even when there's no visible aspect between them, some astrologers will say if it's not one of such and such aspects, then there's no aspect. But I think some astrologers who practice, say, like harmonic astrology, or utilize harmonics in their astrology, they may be inclined to see things from a perspective of the degree of distance from a planet is just as important as a planet, or just as important as planets that have, say, like the main aspects between the two, like squares or oppositions or trines or whatever. Like the little known, or not really little known, it's becoming more and more known, but somewhat obscure aspects, like say the sesquiquadrate, actually are very key gates of evolution. So when somebody has like a 0 degree, especially if it's like an applying sesquiquadrate between two planets, like say Mars and Pluto, trust me, most of them will tell you they feel it. Yeah, it's not as obscure as some may think. So it's worth your consideration. These gates of phases, which, you know, we'll get more into this, of course, too. Phases also lend depth to aspects by setting the stage for the interaction. So for example, a gibbous phase Venus-Mercury quincunx, which is 150-degree aspect, if I'm not mistaken, versus a full phase Venus-Mercury quincunx, which is, I believe it's 210 degrees. Those are very different energies. Gibbous is still in the waxing portion of a cycle of 360 degrees, whereas full phase is past that point and it's beginning to wane, right? Like right at that apex of the full phase, the moon is starting to lose light, you know, metaphorically. So the dynamics are different. So phases can help us understand the stage of the aspects in play that we may be scrutinizing in a chart and trying to figure out or investigate or synthesize. Super useful, especially if you're taking it from a perspective of evolution, cyclic growth, and rhythms. Phases are an indispensable tool from that angle too, as an astrologer who is focused on maybe like past life dynamics or evolution, or even this current life and how to maximize growth by understanding the context of the foundation from which a person is developing. Phases also assist in interpreting aspect patterns, like grand crosses, grand trines, kites, T-squares, or yods. The reason being is that, say like you have a grand cross in a chart and you were reading it, trying to synthesize all of this information. Say it's a grand mutable cross, for example. Understanding what phase each of those 4 points are in relation as pairs can help you to get context into what's growing and maybe what's receding, so that utilizing that grand cross, that grand mutable cross, to the best of one's ability can be more readily comprehended, right? Because on one hand, yeah, a grand cross does speak to an impetus for growth and this type of thing. Definitely character building through adversity, we could say. We can take it even deeper and really understand like why and what's going on there, using phases as an assistant in our work as astrologers. So now let's look at the waxing and waning hemicycles. First off, I just want to say, like looking at the chart, you'll notice that I've split it into 2 halves. Each half is considered a hemicycle or a half cycle. I'm borrowing hemicycle from Dane Rudyard. That is his term, and it might be used by others, but that's where I've heard it from. The first half cycle is a waxing phase. So from 0 degrees to 180 degrees is the waxing phase. From 180 degrees all the way to the end of the cycle to 359 degrees and 59 minutes, we'll say, or 360, that's the waning phase. That's when things are starting to die off. So why I bring this up is that phases show us it mirrors an entire cycle of evolutionary development. And yet within each hemicycle, there are yin and yang phases within. For instance, the new phase is a yang polarity energy. The crescent phase is yin, first quarter is yang, gibbous is yin, full phase is yang, disseminating yin, last quarter yang, and balsamic is yin. So even within this, like the first half, the first hemicycle, that waxing cycle or phase, we could say, is it's largely yang. There's still this kind of sine wave, this inward outward motion that's happening, right? This outward moving and then inward moving energy. So it kind of shows us just the importance of the yin and yang when it comes to growth. Growth can't really happen just moving in one direction. If you move too far into the yang, it's eventually going to run out of steam, right? And if you move too far into the yin, too much inward and not going back outward, it creates kind of like entropy in a sense, right? And so I have up here, it says ANS aspects. What that is applying and separating aspects. Applying are like culminating aspects, and separating is when it's past the point of culmination and the orb is growing as a planet or a point is moving away from the slower moving planet. So applying and separating aspects stand at each gate into the next phase. What I mean by that is the gates here, like for instance, the conjunction at 0 degrees. As a cycle is ending, moving from balsamic toward the new phase, there is this applying that's happening, this approach that's happening. And so each of these gates, which I talk a little bit more later, are very tense points in a chart. They're like gates of initiation, almost like little new phases themselves. And then throughout the whole phase is almost like a mini circle happening within circles. It's interesting when you think about the principle of rhythm and how this applies to astrology. But yeah, so what I mentioned here, though, without going too far off and digressing, we see here, i.e., there are 2 squares per hemicycle. The applying and separating versions are different. So you may have heard of squares. You might have heard of squares. You may have heard of trines, these kinds of things. What's more important actually here, just for the purposes of demonstration, there are actually 4 kinds of squares. 4, that's my 1, 2, 3, 4 fingers. It's pointing them kind of low. Anyway, off camera. So there's actually 4 squares. There's a square that is applying during the crescent phase. This is going to take on very different dynamics from the square in the first quarter phase, which is actually separating from that 90-degree point. And the same goes for the opposite end of the wheel in the waning phase with the disseminating square, which applies towards the last quarter phase. Once it hits 270 degrees, it's actually separating when it's in the last quarter phase. The last quarter and first quarter squares, once they're in that point and they're separating squares, the tension is, it can still exist, especially if it's very close to a 0-degree orb, but it's lessening, right? The tension is dissipating. It's moving or decomposing, dissolving, we could say. Whereas in the crescent phase and the disseminating phase, as 2 planets are approaching towards a square, the tension is actually a lot more fraught with stress. And so the individual who's experiencing any 2 planets in that type of a square, it helps them to know when we're reading their chart why they may be feeling that tension. And why? Well, we can see through the dynamics of these phases, disseminating and crescent. And we'll get more into that because we're going to go into each phase a little more in depth. But I hope that lends you some context into what I'm explaining as far as 4 squares are concerned. This can be seen as well with 2 different types of conjunctions, the balsamic conjunction and the new conjunction, very different energies. You know, balsamic's kind of got like a Pisces Aquarius bent as far as we could say themes go. And then the new phase is very Aryan with some Taurus thrown in. So those types of conjunctions can be quite different. And just for completion's sake, this is going to be true of all of these gates: the opposition, the sesquiquadrate, the semi-square, and so on. So evolution and generation, just a little word on this because, you know, yeah, as my slide says, there are many concurrent relationship cycles developing between the archetypes within our psyche. And they show us how complex each and every one of us are. So, you know, some people say, oh, I'm an old soul, or I'm a new soul. I don't really hear that too much. But we do hear when someone's an old soul. We hear that a lot. Regardless, you know, not to diverge away from this too much, my point is that within your chart or within any chart, even the transit charts, we're going to see many different points of development between any 2 points in the chart. Some will be further along in their stage of development, as far as at least the dynamics of the phases go. And some will be in initiating a brand new purpose or a brand new intention into the world with, say, like new phase or even crescent phase. It's very subjective and can be quite myopic, the new phase, for example. And yet they're exactly where they need to be at the point that they're at. They can't skip the line and go into fruition, 2 planets or points, if they're still in the phase of self-discovery, right? Just as an example. So yeah, each of these cycles are occurring at different stages of development, some in the waxing phase, some in the waning phase. These cycles, sorry, just want to move some things out of the way so I can see. These cycles continue to progress on and on throughout eternity, it seems, you know, or at least as long as we live on this planet. And even then, I mean, just the thoughts of what astrology would be like on other planets and other solar systems and other galaxies, it's just unfathomable. So I guess I'll just rein it in and bring it back to Earth. These cycles that we're experiencing on Earth do continue to progress on, and they have been since time immemorial, it seems, regardless of one's state of awareness and regardless of their volition, cycles continue on. There is yin and yang in everything. And even in the concurrent cycles within us, aligning and accepting the reality of who it is we are and where it is we happen to be at, where we happen to find ourselves, helps us build a momentum towards our best possible potential as exceedingly unique individual beings. I can't express, well, I mean, if you're into astrology, you're a student or you're a practicing astrologer, I think you get it just by virtue of looking at the charts. People are so different. And when we say, oh, you're as different as, everyone has a fingerprint and everyone's as unique as a fingerprint, I feel like that only begins to scratch the surface of just how exceedingly unique we are. So if we know what phase we're experiencing between, say, like our examples today, our Venus and our Saturn and our Pluto and our Mars, or any other 2 points in our chart that we may be feeling drawn to understand a little more deeply, then we can build the momentum based on our rhythms and where it is we're called to go and how it is we're called to express in a way that has a rapport with the universe that can take us outside of the confines of our culture or our traditions, so that we can really individuate and bring forward our joy, our health, and our happiness, and even our success, whatever that is to us and what's important to us. Our ability to be as we truly are serves not only us, but the generations that are born from us into this world too, because the cycles continue and seeds will always be put into the ground as cycles end. Whether they germinate is one thing or another, but when they do, there's codes contained in those seeds from the past, their ancestors, and that's bringing forward the past memories. So that's where I'm coming from when I say our ability to be as we truly are serves not only us, but the generations that are born from us into this world. So it's not selfish to be who you are. It's not selfish to prioritize the flourishing of your heart and your soul and your spirit. And that's my soapbox. Let's get back to learning. The overview of the 8 planetary phases. Yes, so let's just do it real brief and then we're going to go deeper into it, okay? The new phase is a germination phase. Its keywords are birth and emergence. It's very much literally the new phase, right? This is the depth of the dark. If we look at the moon as a metaphor for the planetary phases, what we see here is there's no light at this point. It's starting to build, but it's kind of hard to see in the new phase. So very subjective, right? And then we move into the gate of the semi-square, the 45-degree semi-square, into the crescent phase. This is a yin phase. So we're starting to go back inside. Internalization is a big keyword here. As far as plants go, it's very analogous to the young sprouts. I don't know if you ever sprouted seeds before, but the little root starts and the plant starts poking out from the seed casing, and sometimes the case is still kind of stuck to the plant, but the whole process here is the light is starting to slowly stir, and there's an internalization, a connection to that light that's a little more aware, still subjective, but a little more aware than from the new phase was coming from. Then moving into the first quarter phase, we are strengthening our roots. We are building our stems, and the light is continuing to build. At this point, the light and the dark are at a halfway point. So there's subjectivity, yes, but there's also objectivity here in this phase. And it moves ever further. It's yang, so it's wanting to push toward that fruition. And the first quarter phase is synonymous with the square, the Cancer square, actually, if you look at it from a natural zodiac perspective, right? Whew, all right, slow down, Sarah. Sorry, just give me some water and collect myself here. There's so much to say about this. All right, so from the first quarter phase, that strengthening phase moves into the gate of the sesquiquadrate. This sesquiquadrate has Leo energy, but the whole phase is kind of a Leo Virgo bent, the Gibbous phase. More Virgo, but there's a touch of Leo in there. This is the budding phase, the Gibbous phase. We're adjusting, we're analyzing, the light is beginning to dominate, it's really starting to swell. And so it's just at that point, just before the flower opens up. So there can be this swelling and knowing of one's potential, but needs to adjust to make sure everything's just right at this phase. Moving into the full phase from there, and that was a yin phase, by the way. That's why that analysis and adjustment is a thing. It's a little bit more introspective, that phase. Then we move into the full phase, which is yang. This is the flowering point. This is our social debut, the peak of light. Everyone can see us for what we are. And if we're looking at two planets in relationship, what we can see is the full light of day is illuminating the intentions of this planet. We can see through the socialization and pollination, which are keywords for this phase, we can grow and adjust even further, but it is more about full expression at this point, and then kind of like exchange with others, right? That got that Libra bent, and then it moves a little bit into Scorpio, so it gets a bit more intimate too, if you think about like bees pollinating flowers, right? That whole thing. And then moving into the disseminating phase, which is a yin phase, there's a gate that moves into this, the sesquiquadrate. You'll notice here, there's kind of a pattern going on. Sesquiquadrate, square, semi-square, conjunction, and so on all around the circle. So this disseminating phase is a yin phase. It's about fruition and conveyance. The darkness is starting to become a little more, well, it's not, the interesting thing about darkness is we're not always aware, and it's just starting to stir. So at this phase, there may not be full awareness of the darkness. And what I equate to darkness is it's yin, right? So when you're fruiting, when you think about like fruition, it's not quite at the point where one is ready to die off or decondition, like the last quarter phase in the balsamic. This is the point where we are nourishing, where there's a nourishment that can be derived through the relationship between the two planets that serve to benefit all of society, right? So it's a yin phase because we're giving of ourselves. And I hope that makes sense. Moving into the last quarter phase, this is yang. The yang in this phase actually comes from the decomposition and the breaking down of beliefs and structures that had to do with the previous phases that no longer align to the intentions in the core of the two planets in relationship. This is a point where wisdom can be developed, but it's kind of hard won because there can be this reluctance to let go. As many of us are aware, death can be a very scary thing. And so death is starting to become imminent, though it is a square point here. So there is this half dark, half light. So there's half subjectivity, half objectivity here. But where things are going, that objectivity can actually help us to understand that, well, it literally helps us to objectify the information that we're pulling in here, where through experiences between the two planets, we start learning, oh, wait, certain things that used to work for us before aren't working anymore. We need to adjust. And so there can be this crisis in our consciousness, to borrow a phrase from Dane Rudyard, during the last quarter phase. Then the gate into the balsamic, which is a semi-square aspect. This can be a really difficult point for people moving into balsamic, because that seed release, the total darkness looming, the darkness, again, synonymous with yin. So this can be synonymous with the shadow, the emotional inner landscape, our subconscious, and even our unconscious. Spirituality and the divine can be seen from this phase as well. It's no longer about our needs or the needs of society during this phase. With the two planets in question, what is being asked to come through a person, because the planets are seen as archetypes, at least from my perspective, archetypes of our psyche and our consciousness. During balsamic, we're withdrawing and purifying the, well, literally like the impurities, the sediment, whatever it is that we've accumulated over the course of the entire cycle, metaphorically, that needs to be removed so that the seeds that are being released are as intact as possible with the core intentions that want to be developed between the two planets. I hope that makes sense. We're going to go a little bit more into it, of course. We still got lots to cover. So, you know, we'll go through each phase one by one, much more deeply coming soon. And That's just a highlight of all of them. All right, so the gates into each phase, I mentioned this earlier, bears repeating. The approach to the gate can be an incredibly tense experience for the planets at this point of development. As I mentioned, like with a crescent square, for instance. But to explain it a little more deeply, like a crescent square, why it's more intense is because it's, well, if you think about square energy, especially right at the point of 90 degrees, like right when it's at 0 degrees, we could say the square, the most intense point the square can be, there is this deep, visceral need to act on something. And the frustration or the compulsion that's in that energy to push forward, it can kind of like color a frequency within a person or through a person in such a way where it can invite necessary conflict. Some people might look at a square between two planets, especially ones that could be quite volatile, like say Uranus and Mars, and say, oh, well, a lot of violence is coming into my life and I'm experiencing a lot of conflicts and I don't know what to do with them. When you understand that, just to get back onto the point, like say it's a crescent square between Uranus and Mars, it can help the person understand that these experiences are coming into their life so that they can connect to, especially in the crescent phase, values that are intrinsic to them so that they're not dying off and allowing their roots to atrophy. It's helping them to move out of inertia so that they can build momentum to move into the first quarter phase and begin establishing the root structure of their identity and ego as they evolve toward, full fruition and so on. And of course, in one person's, just to be clear, like in one person's life, they're not going to move out of that phase, those two planets. I mean, you can look at progressions and see changes, of course, as far as how things are developing. So you may notice that they change from one phase to another. But as far as the natal chart is concerned, there's always going to be that core dynamic of whatever phase two planets are in relationship to each other for the entirety of the life. And so when I talk about that development, what I mean is like development, say like from that Uranian Martian square from crescent phase into first quarter and so on, as I just mentioned, the intention is to work with what's coming through our life with sincerity so that we are developing in a way that is serving our evolutionary growth on like a soul and spirit level, but in a way that also serves the development of humanity through generations, right? I hope that makes sense. Okay, let's go into the step-by-step process and then we'll go into phases. Yay, more deeply into phases. So the anchor planet, this is actually really simple. This process is super simple. Interpreting each phase may be a little more challenging, sure. But if you understand the basics of how to do this, at least you have a foundation, a really good, no pun, anchor to work from to keep you from just to help keep you steady as you deepen your knowledge of each phase. So first things first, the anchor planet is the slower moving planet, right? And then the faster moving planet is developing the relationship between the anchor planet as it traverses through the cycle of phases. Let's look at that more in a graphic, okay? Here's how we apply the 8-phase lunation model to planets, points, angles, etc. So if we were thinking of the lunation model, we'd have the sun, and then we'd have the moon, happily moving around the earth and reflecting light from the sun in different ways as it moves through that cycle. The sun is considered the slower moving planet in relation, because sometimes, I just want to say this, some people might think in the lunation cycle, they might forget about the sun, that the sun's a partner in this. I don't know, maybe not, but I think it might be a potential for some. So I want to highlight this. The sun's a partner in the lunation model, in the lunation cycle. So sun, slower moving planet, aka the anchor planet, moon, faster moving planet, aka the cycling planet. It is really that straightforward. It's really easy. If you can determine, and maybe I should put a link in for this, because if you go on NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory site, you can actually find out the exact speed of asteroids and things if you're trying to work with those and you don't know necessarily how fast they move in relation to each other. So Note to self, please remember that, Sarah. Okay, anyway, back to the point. Sun, slower moving planet. This is the anchor point of the core / original intention, quote unquote, agreed upon by the 2 points in phase. We can look at the anchor to remember where the cycling planet has come from in order to get context from a foundational point of view. So say you're looking at, I don't know, like Mercury and ascendant, and you're trying to, and Mercury would be the slower moving planet there, slower moving planet, but you're trying to figure out ascendant Mercury, gibbous phase, like what's going on there. You do a little bit of investigation backwards and just think about the position of Mercury, which will give you insight into the intention agreed upon between the 2 planets, right? So let's just say Mercury is in Virgo, right? Then there's going to be a core intention that has to do with Virgoan themes. We'll look at more examples to get deeper into this, of course, but I just wanted to explain that. So the moon is the cycling planet, as I said. It's the point that reveals what is happening between the 2 as it cycles through the 8 phases. It shows the phase the 2 are currently experiencing together in relationship. So for example, just quickly, just to, because I do have examples as we go through each phase. We're going to go through synthesis examples, but I just want to show you visually how you would determine the anchor and cycling planet using a couple examples. So we're going to do that now. Anchor planet is Saturn in this case. Cycling planet is Jupiter. Because Saturn is slower than Jupiter, it would take the position of the sun metaphorically, and Jupiter would take the position of the moon as it moves through the phases. So I have it here at new phase, but you know, that's just for graphics. I didn't want to put a Jupiter glyph in every single one. All right, anyway. So as you can see though, Jupiter would be moving through that cycle where Saturn would stay stationary, more or less. Next example I have here is Neptune and the ascendant. So this one is pretty obvious, but I just wanted to show you an example with an angle here. Neptune would be considered the sun, so to speak, the anchor planet. And the cycling planet, or point in this case, angle, is the ascendant. So you can read those 2 in relationship. Just remember where Neptune is considered the point of original intention, the intention that was agreed upon between the 2 points, and then the ascendant, wherever it is showing up, like let's say last quarter phase, the ascendant is going to show the point in development that the 2 are at in relationship to each other. And 2 closer planets, just to show you, the anchor planet, Mars, because it's slower, and then the cycling planet would be Venus. All right, so let's jump in now and get deeper into the phases. New phase, yay, it's yang, so it's upward and outward moving energy. Keywords that are that I've chosen to describe the new phase are birth and initiation, emergence, subjectivity, super subjective, right? Because it doesn't really see anything at this point. If you look even at the graphic, this is just a seed. It just poked out its root. It just started to grow, right? It doesn't really know what it's going to become yet. It doesn't know. In this case, it looks like a mung bean, but like, let's think of like an oak tree, right? That seed is not, it may not be entirely aware at this point that it's going to become a mighty oak tree one day. You know, it's not quite there. So there is a lot of subjectivity. Instinctual action is invariably, because of that subjectivity, there's that connection to instinctual action. And myopia, 2/3 cardinal fire, Aries, 1/3 fixed earth energy, because it covers the span of 0 degrees to 44 degrees in 59 minutes, or you could just say 45, but I had to go extra on that one. It'd be super specific. New phase. All right. And so each of the phases, what I've chosen to do is take wisdom from 3 sources on each phase to help us understand the dynamics of each phase. And then we're going to synthesize 2 planets. Well, I have Saturn and Venus as a pair, and Pluto and Mars are going to be our examples throughout each phase. So Demetra George is our first expert on the phases. She says, The first phase of cyclic process is depicted by the birth of the light at both the new moon and the winter solstice. The process begins when the seed containing the new vision is infused with an intention, breaks free, the process begins when the seed containing a new vision, infused with an intention, breaks free from its capsule and germinates in the darkness. At this first stage, the evolving soul initiates a new cycle of experience by incarnating into a body, allowing a subjective sense of new possibilities to surface and projecting an identity into the world. The energy emerges out of the void and projects itself forward. Then we have the EA glossary, that's the evolutionary astrology glossary. There are expert number 2 here, and then we also have Mark Jones weighing in on all of the phases as well. So the EA glossary says this of the new phase: the beginning of a cycle. Action is instinctual. Absolute freedom is required. The question is, who am I? The actions one takes brings feedback, and oh boy, can it at the new phase. At the table eating with your bare hands because you just don't know that there's forks there and what they're even for. Anyway, as the energies have totally combined, it is not possible at first to really know what is happening. And the only approach to life that can be taken as far as those two functions, now combined energy, is concerned, is an instinctual one. It's a subconscious sense of the new. Like a baby, right? Brand new in the world. All right. Random new and spontaneous experiences will be initiated in order to discover this new purpose at the new phase. In a way, the self is not meant to understand or reflect on this process. Instead, it is through actions and our reactions to those that we stumble across ourselves, rather like a child discovering that the oven is hot through touching it. This process corresponds to a yang energy, fiery and instinctual, masculine outgoing energy, and therefore requires a fundamental freedom in order to be able to initiate new experiences. Obviously, there may be problems if this perpetual instinctual need for self-discovery is hampered or restricted in some way. Great frustration and anger may build up. This potential tension is highlighted in the first 30 degrees of the new phase because it's the Aries section, as here the instinctual need for freedom is at its strongest. Though I will add that because fixed earth Taurus is involved in the new phase, there can be that just that fixed earth, I don't want to move stubbornness that can be connected to it as well. So there is something to be said for the Taurus energy in this phase as far as that is concerned. Of course, it's going to take on its own elemental property, but I just thought that was worth mentioning. Whoops. Okay, so our first example using Mars and Pluto, in this case, of course, the anchor planet's going to be Pluto because its orbit is like 248 years and Mars is a lot less than that at just around 2 years or so. So Mars keywords, we're going to be using the same keywords more or less throughout the entire cycle just to keep things really focused. But of course, there's going to be so many more keywords you can use for Mars, Pluto, and a new phase. Just like I said, I want to keep things focused, and even the synthesis examples that I'll be using throughout, this is just 1 or 2 examples for each phase that I'm going to be sharing. Many other ways we can interpret this. Correlation and observation and context are everything, right? So just remember that when you're applying this, and hopefully these examples can help you as a guideline at the very least. Okay, so Mars, action taking, of course, fighting style, expression of will. Pluto, compulsions, deepest unconscious desires, transformation and metamorphosis, of course. And the new phase, emergence, myopia, instinctive action, and that slash movement, instinctive movement, right? That's where I'm going with that. So a synthesis of Mars and Pluto new phase could be a compulsive expression of will that is emerging through instinctive action and or movement. Like it can be that simple. And of course, when we look at these dynamics through the context of the uniqueness of an individual, of course, the colors are going to burst off of the page and show so much more texture and depth. But it can be this simple to start with the synthesis and then work from there. A compulsive expression of will that is emerging new phase through instinctive new phase action or movement, right? Pretty straightforward, right? I really feel like it is. Once you get the hang of it, though phases can be a bit intimidating, the more you use it, it's just like riding a bike, like you'll totally figure out how to move those pedals. Okay. So Venus and Saturn, anchor planet Saturn, right? And cycling planet Venus. Venus's keywords for our class today are self-worth, relating style, romance, sense of aesthetics, and beauty. Saturn, limitations, maturation, burdens, and discipline. And again, we already looked at the new phase keywords here. Emergence, myopia, instinctive action, and movement. So I have two examples here for Saturn and Venus. Saturn and Venus, okay, synthesis, yes. A sense of aesthetics is emerging instinctively in a burdensome fashion in order to focus on beautifully moving through limitations. Saturn and Venus aspects can be, like relationships in general, can be kind of tough. But like I was saying, anywhere in that 360-degree wheel, Venus and Saturn are going to be having a conversation, even if there's no apparent aspect displaying in our software or through our calculations. That said, we can see by the phase, at least as a foundation, what's going on foundationally between the two planets. Another example I have between Saturn and Venus is an instinctual, so that's like new phase, romantic / relating style, Venus, that is moving myopically, new phase. This experiences limits Saturn as it builds discipline Saturn. An instinctual romantic / relating style that is moving myopically experiences limits as it builds discipline. So we could say discipline with regard to romantic or relating styles, discipline with regard to moving myopically. Since Saturn's involved, it's of course going to color how the new phase is being acted on, but there's still going to be that myopic movement. The discipline is going to have a lot to do with what is coded into the core intention of what's wanting to be developed in the person's Saturn, if that makes sense. All right, moving into the crescent phase, yin phase, down and in, down and in, internalization, struggle, inertia, aeration, and shedding the antiquated are keywords that we can see and key phrases associated with the crescent phase. It's 1/3 fixed Earth, Taurus, 2/3 mutable air, Gemini, 45 degrees to 89 degrees and 59 minutes, covers the span of the crescent phase. This graphic is not here for no reason. As you notice, there is this seed capsule that is still connected to the shoot. I added this in relation to the other seedlings that are sprouting, just to show how the crescent phase can still, that shedding of the antiquated keyword, the crescent phase can still have the remnants of the past attached to it as it struggles forward in its development, right? So these graphics may help you to kind of like internalize the concepts of this whole phase thing. All right, so Demetra George, the second phase of cyclic process, signified by the crescent moon, is analogous to the cross-quarter day of Candlemas, or Imbolc. I think I'm saying that right. I freaking hope so. February 2nd, when the light quickens. Now, the first tender shoots of this vision have struggled against the force of gravity to push themselves above the ground. At this second stage, the evolving soul is enfolded with matter and likewise struggles to overcome the backward pull of the past in order to move forward. It must claim possession of the body, very Taurus, right? Gradually focusing its vision and develop new talents and skills. The flow of energy at this stage of cyclic process is a confrontation against resistance and inertia, trying to push through and establish one's fledgling identity. And it's, of course, it's yin, so this pushing is coming from within, right? It's about building momentum from a sense of self-worth in a sense. A sense of self-worth in a sense. Yeah, you get it, I'm sure. All right, so the evolutionary astrology glossary says, the feedback has been obtained, like the feedback from the previous phase, right? That feedback from the outer world. The need to withdraw and come to an understanding of who one is. So the feedback has been obtained. but it's still a very subjective point in development. So there's this, I need to come into myself to feel what's right for me, to understand who I am, where I'm going, and what I'm wanting to bring into the world. It's a very, very personal phase, the crescent phase. Mark Jones says, by the time the crescent phase is entered, it is time to fundamentally slow down and consolidate what has gone on before. This is a Taurus archetype being finalized, Taurus being from 30 to 60 degrees. And therefore, we are looking at a process of establishing and maintaining the new forms that were discovered in the new phase. As such, we begin a yin process of returning inward to the center and evaluating the experience that has already been had thus far. So let's look at our examples, Mars and Pluto. Oh, right. So the keywords for the crescent phase, again, are internalization, struggle, inertia, aeration, shedding the antiquated, which we could say like are the seed husks, and even that part in the seed that feeds the seed a little bit. And I keep getting this word mispronounced, but this is the word. It's like cotyledon or something like that. It's the little bit inside of the seed that has nutrients to help nourish the seed so that it has a little something to go on as it's starting to build its roots and that kind of thing, right? But during the crescent phase, it's trying to move out of that to not necessarily be dependent on the past. So that's why I'm using seed husks and the cotyledon, I hope I'm saying that right, as examples, metaphorically likening it to plants, this process of the crescent phase. Okay, so Mars and Pluto. Synthesize, go. Internalization and aeration, we could say as objective curiosity, aka Gemini, right? Of the struggles experienced while shedding antiquated parts of one's deepest unconscious desires, Pluto. This provides the insight required to optimally metamorphose their fighting style, right? Through internalization and objective curiosity of the struggle so that they can shed antiquated parts that are holding back that little tender seedling that is wanting to establish itself in reality through the archetypes here of Mars and Pluto, right? With Venus and Saturn, we see a synthesis looking like this at the crescent phase, struggling with the burden, Saturn, of inertia, in developing one's sense of self-worth, Venus. Through internalization, a felt sense of how to best mature begins to form. So this is how someone with Venus and Saturn at crescent phase could apply, or we could say work with these energies in a way that makes sense for them, right? Rather than being trying to work with other points and phases or with cultures or values or traditions or society in ways that might be not actually helping them where they're at their point in life, right? I mean, even friends or, people that mean well in general might give advice to somebody at this stage, and yet, or any stage really, and yet the main, well, not the main, but I guess what's most useful for a person is to, especially at crescent, go within, feel, why am I struggling? The answers come from within in many cases, in all phases, but it's going to be emphasized in the crescent phase. Even the full phase, the answers come from within paradoxically, and yet you're getting feedback from the outer. But anyway, digressing, let's move on. All right, first quarter phase, yang phase, again, up and out, right? We're strengthening at this point. We are experiencing crisis in action. So there's this, why, I got to push, like, why am I feeling all this push back or even pull back towards the past? I got to build my ego. So building ego is a big part of this phase. It's, some people say, oh, the ego is not a great thing. Tell that to somebody experiencing a first quarter phase square. It's actually really important to their development. They need to get to know who they are on the inside and to establish that in the world on some level, right? To grow themselves. Otherwise, they're diminishing themselves and it's of no service to them. So again, useful to know. So anyway, forceful, it's going to be part of that. And anchoring intentions, anchoring our intentions like roots into the ground and out through our stems, so to speak, as we are continuing to develop in the world. 2/3 cardinal water is the first quarter phase. That is Cancer energy. 1/3 fixed fire, so there's going to be some Leo in this as well, which speaks to, again, Cancer and Leo. They both kind of have this inner outer ego thing going on, like Cancer, inner ego, Leo, outer ego, right? 90 degrees to 134 degrees in 59 minutes covers the span of the first quarter phase. Okay, let's look at what our experts have to say about this phase, because they've got some great insights that I wanted to share with you. All right, Dimitri George, what do you got to say? The third phase of cyclic process is depicted by the first quarter moon, when there is an equal amount of light and dark corresponding to the spring equinox. And there is a balance between daylight and nighttime hours during this point. Now the light force steadily increases. At this stage, the plant sends its roots downward and its stem and leaves upward, yang energy, right? Creating a strong structural foundation to support the flower and fruit that is yet to come. The life force of the evolving soul and the personality by taking direct action to anchor the vision and build a similar structural foundation to support the larger purpose that is yet to be revealed. Kind of stumbled on that, so I'm going to repeat it just to make sure it's clear for everyone. The life force of the evolving soul activates the personality by taking direct action to anchor the vision and build a similar structural foundation to support the larger purpose that is yet to be revealed. The flow of energy is forceful and direct, clearing away obstacles in order to build. So with like half that light and half that dark, half objective and half subjective, and the light building, if we think about that, though at this phase, two planets, the archetypes of two planets may not be fully aware of what they are going to become, it is becoming more apparent, at least the direction it is that they want to take. And then the determination is increasing at this point too, right? Okay. The Evolutionary Astrology Glossary says, one now has an understanding of who one is. At least, you know, to the extent that we're at this point, 1/4 of the way through 360 degrees. So now the question is, what specific form do I take? What form do I take? A time of intense activity, building one's foundations in terms of who one is. Very, very pivotal point, the first quarter phase. Mark Jones says, the entrance to this phase is marked by the importance of the first square being either in its crescent phase or having actually entered the first quarter phase. This marks the movement to another yang phase where the energy once more seeks to go outwards from the center, although this phase is the territory of the Cancer archetype, which is a yin sign. So there's kind of a paradox here. Because it is a keystone of the cardinal cross, it operates within the cycle of the phases as a transition point to an outgoing energy. Here represented by the waxing square, which Dane Rudyard has named as a point of crisis in action, the square representing a fundamental challenge as to what to do next. Mars and Pluto, let's look at that from a first quarter phase perspective. And the first quarter phase keywords again are strengthening, ego building, anchoring intentions, forceful, and crisis in action. Metamorphosis, Pluto, of the expression of will, Mars, through crises, first quarter phase, that serve to strengthen the ego identity and anchor one's intentions in accord with one's deepest unconscious desires, can be seen at this phase when we are relating it from the perspective of Mars and Pluto in relationship together. Of course, just one angle on this. One angle on this. So you can see it from so many, but this is a pretty decent foundational synthesis that may apply in many cases. Looking at the first quarter phase from the perspective of Venus and Saturn, we can see, let's see here, anchoring the intentions of one's relating style, Venus, in ways that utilize limitations in self-worth in order to build a disciplined sense of self-worth. Building the ego serves to strengthen one's self-esteem. This would be the time for sure. Remember, there's a little bit of Leo in there. We got that Cancer energy too. So although there can be crises in action and forcefulness that's either being experienced from within a person or in relation to other people or even vocationally or whatever it is during this phase, when we look at the concept of building ego, And then Cancer and Leo, it is so very useful for a person at this phase to be nurturing those stems and roots, watering them, we could say, like Cancer, nourishing them, but also giving them a lot of good sunlight, we could say Leo, right? In a way that's helping them to see that they're important, that they're being seen, that we want to, that they're wanted, you know? And so if they can feel like that from within, it helps give them the push to really move through those crises in action and strengthen and anchor themselves and establish their ego in a way that connects to who it is they truly are, right? That's a healthy way to look at it, at least. Of course, it can go in many different directions depending on what's going on in a person's life, or, you know, many different factors. Gibbous phase. The gibbous phase, this is a yin phase, so we are moving down and in. Analysis is a big point of this phase. Adjustment, perfecting, and it's that budding phase, like we could see in the picture here, like the flower. I picked this one because you can see the petals a little bit, right, in the flower, but it's still not open yet. It's getting to the point of opening. We got a bit of Leo in there with 1/3 fixed fire energy, and Virgo takes up the bulk of this phase with 2/3 mutable earth energy, spanning from 135 to 179 degrees and 59 minutes. Why is there a green F down here? Anyway, gibbous phase. Demetra George says this about the gibbous phase. The fourth phase of cyclic process, represented by the gibbous moon, corresponds to the seasonal cross-quarter day of Beltane, when the light force is rapidly increasing. Our daylight hours are getting longer, and we see the moon swelling towards her fullness. At this stage, the plant is putting forth buds with the promise and expectation that the flower will bloom. The evolving soul looks back to the structures it has created in order to evaluate and improve upon them. The flow of energy is geared towards analyzing one's expression, finding ways of perfecting one's structures so that they can be worthy containers, and integrating them into the reality of the environment so they can be of practical use to others. Very Virgoan, but there's a lot of Leo in there too, because there is this sense of one's innate specialness and importance. And yet with the Virgo energy, you know, we're learning to adjust based on the realities of the environment we're in, much like Demetra George has so astutely put forth. Let's see what the EA glossary says. Very to the point. The old egocentric ways are no longer working. Like the sesquiquadrate is a very awkward gate, right? Like it's got that Leo bent, so it's like, I'm special, I'm important, I have something to say, and I want to express myself, but yet because sesquiquadrate is like an eighth harmonic aspect, that gate into the phase, there is this tone of, yeah, but you also need to, as the evolutionary astrology glossary says, reevaluate. There's a realization that it's not about me anymore. So we're starting to mature a bit at this point, right? Mark Jones says, here in the gibbous phase, energy begins to return to the center again. It's a yin phase, right? This is because we are witnessing another key transition. At the waxing trine, which was back in the first quarter phase, we embody the Leo archetype, but here we begin a journey towards Virgo in preparation for Libra, i.e. our full flowering of individuality must undergo a period of crisis and process of becoming more humble and self-analytical as a result, in order to prepare for the social integration of the full phase. Our social debut, which is like my favorite phrase for the full phase. But anyway, Mars and Pluto, synthesizing it from the perspective of Gibbous. We could see it manifesting this way. Experiencing humiliation when expressing one's will compulsively offers the opportunity to analyze and adjust the ways one takes action to create results that are perfecting how one goes about getting their deepest desires met. So it's not about not expressing one's will or feeling humiliated and then just not, doing anything, because Gibbous can have that Virgo bent of, analysis paralysis and never really acting. It is yin, right? So there's kind of even like this self-conscious, we could say, yeah, self-consciousness, self-criticism, like the Virgo trappings can be part of this phase too. So a healthy way to experience it would be using the data we receive and even humiliation to learn how to adjust. and perfect what it is we're trying to bring forth, right? What we're trying to really bring forth and experience as far as Pluto goes, getting their deepest desires met. Venus and Saturn synthesis could look like this. And again, those keywords are analysis, adjustment, perfecting, budding, and humility. Venus and Saturn in Gibbous phase synthesis, building discipline in romance and relating in order to adjust the aesthetic of interactions in ways that develop maturity, humility, and self-worth. Gibbous phase Venus and Saturn could have trouble in relationships where they might lower themselves, or maybe have experienced situations where they aren't being treated in a way that is really fair or synonymous with the truth of their value. You know, it could happen. And so using this planetary pair, understanding it from the perspective of Gibbous can really help a person to develop their discipline in romance and relating, right? So that they can develop, like literally develop their self-worth and also their humility in a way that doesn't make them like prostrate themselves to others or lower themselves beneath others. Yang phase, hooray. Let's check my time here. Okay, let's get going. Yang phase, full phase. It is up and out. We are moving outwards. As we can see, the bee is moving, getting ready to pollinate that flower. It wants to just get into the flower stuff. And the flower's like, I'm here and I'm ready. It's totally the full phase, right? We're socializing, we're pollinating, we're flowering, we're partnering, we're listening, and we're also comparing. 2/3 cardinal air takes up the full phase and 1/3 fixed water. So that's Libra and Scorpio respectively. 180 degrees to 224 degrees in 59 minutes spans the full phase. Demetra George says, the light peaks at the 5th phase of cyclic process shown by the maximum amount of reflected light at the full moon phase and the longest hours of daylight at the summer solstice. Now halfway around the lunation cycle, the flower opens and blooms. The vision is fully illuminated and the evolving soul becomes conscious, clearly seeing its purpose and beginning to infuse the meaning of its life into the structures that were initiated, built, and perfected in the first 4 incarnations, which, you know, AKA phases, right? In the same way that the flower has to be pollinated in order to bear fruit, the soul at the full moon phase must open itself to receive someone or something from outside itself into itself in order to fertilize the cycle and bear fruit. Yeah, the disseminating phase follows the full phase for a reason, right? That the flower needs to be pollinated, otherwise no fruit will be born. You know, it just won't happen. So this interaction is very, very important. Not just in the moon phase, like Demetra was talking about, like I was saying, we can apply these lunation models. We can derive from them how we would use the planetary pairs from the perspective of phase, right? Evolutionary Astrology Glossary. The dilemma is now in the full light of day. This is me versus what is required of me in the social sphere, comparing and contrasting self to everyone else, the necessary feedback from significant others in one's life to begin the process of integrating one's self or one's sense of purpose into the social sphere. So full phase wants to socialize, it wants to get feedback. And if you think about the polar opposite Aries or the new phase, it's you know, it's getting feedback, but it's not concerned about getting feedback. It's concerned about its imperative and just moving into the world, right? Both yang phases, but very, very different polar ends, dynamics at each pole, right? Very different dynamics at each pole. Mark Jones says, the full phase opposition mirrors the archetypal conflict or paradox represented by the ascendant and the 1st house and the descendant and the 7th house. And indeed, relationships can become the great educator in the learning of balance. The great danger in intimacy is excessive proximity, which leads to distortions occurring. Everyone knows that feeling of having to be free from their partner for a while to revitalize their experience of independence. One of the trappings of the full phase is to kind of lose ourselves in others, right? That can be a folly in this phase, but great objectivity is also a gift of this phase, conversely. So Mars and Pluto synthesized for full phase using keywords socialization, pollination, flowering, partnership, listening, and comparison. Through comparison and social interactions, it is revealed how and where one needs to transform compulsive ways of taking action, fighting, and expressing the will. So, kind of paying attention to what's going on in the social sphere helps a person get the data required to figure out where it is they need to change, to adapt, to metamorphosize, to transform ways of taking action, fighting, and expressing their will. With Venus and Saturn, we could synthesize the full phase between the two as this: a flowering sense of beauty, aesthetics, and romance prompts one to socialize and partner up with others. Listening and comparison used in a disciplined manner offers opportunities to work through perceived limitations. Yeah, Venus is loves the full phase, right? Because there's that Libra bent to it. If we consider the cycle from a natural zodiac perspective, there's a lot of Libra showing up here. So it's going to be inclined to want to flower and open into this, but yet with Saturn energy there, and Saturn is exalted in Libra too. So there's a lot of potential for a person in the full phase between Venus and Saturn, though it can be if we look at it from the perspective of aspect, Venus opposition to Saturn can be one of the more tough aspects to experience for Venus, as far as self-worth and relating and like a sense of self-esteem is concerned. And yet with context, the limitations in relationships and even like the burdens in relationships and the hard knocks of reality in relationships that can be experienced during Venus Saturn opposition, or in this case here, like the theme of the full phase is related to that opposition largely. There can be a maturation that builds through connecting to one's own intrinsic sense of self-worth and aesthetics and romance, but it has to come through socializing and partnering up, right? And really listening and comparing oneself in a way that's using discipline, as the synthesis example states. The previous phase, Gibbous, is like that humiliation, and that humility was being developed metaphorically in the previous phase. So it wasn't just for the Gibbous phase, it was to carry it forward. And we can see in the full phase how that could be utilized, right? To be objective, air element energy, in order to transform and flower into that state that it is that we truly want to show the world, like transform, like Scorpio bit of this phase. That's why I was saying that. All right, so disseminating phase, we're moving back into yin, so we're moving down and in again, going back into the self a bit to kind of come into what's within us. But this one's a bit different, right? We're giving of the fruits of our efforts up until this point. So it is the fruition phase, the disseminating phase. Conveyance, conformity, wisdom, adaptability, and beliefs are connected to this. 1/3 Scorpio, so Scorpio or fixed water is connected to this, and 2/3 Sagittarius, mutable fire, are the energetic, like elemental themes of this phase. 225 degrees to 269 degrees and 59 minutes is the span of the disseminating phase. Dimitri George describes the disseminating phase thus. The 6th phase of cyclic process opens at the disseminating moon, when the moon is still full, but the first stirrings of darkness begin to occur. This corresponds to the seasonal cross-quarter day of Lammas on August 1st, when the daylight hours begin to shorten. The flower begins to fold in upon itself as it forms the fruit. The stage marks the apex or fruition of the cycle, when the vision is acted upon and lived out through the lives of humanity, thereby fulfilling its purpose. The evolving soul embodies this meaning and lives out its purpose, spreading what it has found to be of value and conveying its message and vision. Fully integrating oneself / one's sense of purpose into the social sphere is what the Evolutionary Astrology Glossary has to say. What has been learned enters the mainstream. Conveyance, right? That keyword conveyance. We are kind of moving into society now. We're finding our place in society and sharing the fruits of our wisdom at this stage. Influential is kind of a keyword that I didn't add here, but I could see that, like influencers and influential. Mark Jones says the disseminating phase represents the totality of any existing society, its rules, laws, and customs. This is more than just the pressure of those in your existing social sphere, which we could kind of see in the previous phase, the full phase. You could kind of liken it to that. Things are opening up now here, right, in the disseminating phase as far as scope is concerned. At the evolutionary gate of transferring from full phase to the disseminating phase, conformity is demanded. This may be a great struggle, particularly for those in the individuated evolutionary state. Here there is a flavor of the inconjunct, as there is a necessary adjustment found here. For those in the individuated state, it is all about rethinking the meaning of conformity. For example, if I take part and fulfill my obligations, whilst inside I remain true to my purpose and myself, then ultimately the last lap is mine. So it's kind of interesting Mark Jones says that, because as far as I know, I think I believe that he's a psychotherapist. He's either a psychotherapist or a psychologist. Either way, he works with the psyche from societal conventional means, but he's also an astrologer, right? So I think he really gets the themes and nuances of the disseminating phase from this perspective. Mars and Pluto disseminating phase. We've got two brief examples here to describe how that could look. Remember, fruition, conveyance, conformity, wisdom, beliefs, and adaptability are the keywords we've chosen to describe this phase for this class. Synthesis could look like this. The fruition of wisdom as it relates to how one expresses their will based on what exists within the deep layers of the unconscious self. We are seeing that fruition at this point, the fruition of their wisdom. In turn, we could see it going even further in the following example, where they begin to convey how to transform one's way of fighting and taking action, as an example, perhaps philosophically or martially, like in a martial art, right? We could see that during this phase between Mars and Pluto. With Venus and Saturn, our examples of synthesis are the fruition of the maturation of one's sense of apologies, getting tongue-tied. So much to say and so much to convey here, like no pun, no joke. Okay, super serious, Sarah, serious face. The fruition of the maturation of one's sense of aesthetics and beauty. Adapting to limitations in order to conform one's style of relating, which enables them to convey their beliefs/wisdom beautifully. So like an influencer, right? Somebody who knows how to use Venus and Saturn in practical ways, but also ways that are helping to convey to their audience or to society beauty, a sense of aesthetics, like their own, we could say hard-won wisdom can be shared at this point, and yet they make it look so simple. Venus, Saturn, like at this phase, there's a disseminating trine, for instance, within the disseminating phase, right? So yeah, especially if you're at that trine point of the phase, it's like, wow, they make it look so easy, right? It's like flawless expression of sense of self-esteem and aesthetics, and just that's kind of almost like statuesque presence. And of course we can see it from many different angles, but that's just what I'm thinking of now. That's what comes to mind. All right, last quarter phase. We are getting very close to the end. The light is really starting to build at this point. Whereas in the waxing hemicycle, there was this push towards life and growth and fruition. Now we're at a point where, all things that rise must eventually fall. So the falling is starting to happen. The crisis in belief is a keyword for this phase for no reason. Whereas with the first quarter phase, there was the crisis in action, right? That crisis that was causing one to need to push and establish themselves, establish their ego. Now we're starting to break down the parts of the ego that are not necessary for what's to come. We're assimilating at this stage, like that's an accurate keyword, assimilating wisdom and data that, like kind of digesting those fruits, taking in the nutrients that our body needs, so to speak, or the two planets in question, what they need for what's to come as they develop their seed in the balsamic phase and purify it and ready it for the coming cycle after this. So deconditioning is a big piece of this, getting rid of the dross, so to speak, right? Breaking down and breaking free. 2/3 cardinal earth, Capricorn energy, and 1/3 fixed air, Aquarius energy comprise the last quarter phase, spanning from 270 degrees to 314 degrees and 59 minutes. Demetra George hook us up with some wisdom. She says, this 7th phase of cyclic process is marked by half light, half dark. The last quarter, also called the 3rd quarter or waning crescent, moon, mirrors the time of the fall equinox, when daylight and nighttime hours are once again in balance. The natural dark force of nature begins to gain. In the plant cycle, the crop is harvested and whatever has been realized throughout the cycle is ingested and assimilated. The fruit that is left on the vine begins to wither and decompose. Once the purpose of the cycle has been fulfilled, the deconstruction process begins. What was built up must now be broken down. The evolving soul begins to revise its thinking based on a new awareness gained from the previous phases, and it begins to reject limiting belief systems, reevaluating and reorganizing its ideology. The flow of energy turns away from the old and begins to reorient to intimations of the future. EA Glossary says, questioning the underlying beliefs that have underpinned all prior actions, detaching from what one has created and the social sphere in which one has participated. Starting to become a bit of a hermit, maybe. I mean, at least psychologically, right? At this square, a fundamental crisis in belief is generated, which causes a natural disengagement from the existing society. A dual awareness is created at the disseminating square, which would be the square that's applying into the last quarter phase, just for clarity. Yeah, a dual awareness is created at the disseminating square. One part is participating in the existing society, right, disseminating, yet the other is standing apart from the very thing it's participating in, moving towards last quarter phase. What is it that needs to be dropped from the life? This can be an incredibly intense experience, I'll just add, in the last quarter phase, and can create the temptation to borrow or align oneself with the past due to security represented there, right? Like, I don't want to die. I don't want to become irrelevant. I don't want to be confused. These can be themes that are experienced in the last quarter phase, right? As we move towards Balsamic, which can be super confusing because there's a lot of Pisces action going on in that phase. Mars and Pluto, last quarter phase, using the keywords assimilation, crisis in belief, deconditioning, breakdown, and break free. The synthesis could look like this. A crisis in belief catalyzes the impetus to assimilate and decondition from no longer fruitful compulsive expressions of will. Let's just say that again to make sure I said it clearly, but first I'm just going to cough. Sorry about that. All right. A crisis in belief, so that's last quarter phase, catalyzes the impetus to assimilate and decondition, last quarter phase, from no longer fruitful, again, last quarter phase, compulsive, Pluto, expressions of will, Mars. That could be a really uncomfortable time for Mars and Pluto, you know? It's a lot more psychological than the first quarter phase in certain respects, though you could still see physical world conflict arising from the two. But certainly because so much yin is building, like darkness at this point, psychology is going to be more of a key theme when it comes to synthesis of any 2 points, not just Mars and Pluto. All right, so Venus and Saturn in the last quarter phase, assimilation of the data provided from limitations in relating and romance, and how this process serves to break free from burdens that conditioning had placed upon the individual up until now. So we can also see like Demetra, I think it was saying of, assimilating the nutrients from the plants, from the fruits, and breaking down and breaking free being keywords of here, deconditioning, right? Breaking down what was built up until now. We're taking in that data for Venus and Saturn. Taking in the data to understand like why those limitations exist. At this point in the last quarter, the limitations are existing because of the need to break free. So alternative relationships may need to be built, relationships that might stand away from the status quo, might need to be built or embodied at this phase for someone with Venus and Saturn in last quarter phase. Okay, so we're at Balsamic now. This is about as dark as it gets. I mean, new phase is incredibly dark too. That seed is underground, but the dark is looming. It's a foreboding time, and yet for one who's connected to the cycles and understands that all things must eventually die, there can be this can be an incredible point of purification and releasing, and that confusion we see in the keywords here, it can be dissolved so that one can connect to what needs to be connected to at a stage where death is inevitable. Keywords again are culmination, withdrawal, confusion, purification, and releasing. 1/3 fixed air, Aquarius, so there's some objectivity in there in this phase. There's also a lot of subjectivity with 2/3 mutable water, Pisces energy, which is, I think, where a lot of the confusion comes in during this phase, especially as it starts to culminate toward that final conjunction. Spanning 315 degrees and 359 degrees and 59 minutes is the yin balsamic phase. The 8th and final stage of cyclic process is symbolized by the waning balsamic moon dissolving into darkness. The cross-quarter seasonal holiday of Halloween on October 31st, or Samhain, because I know some friends of mine will get real mad if I don't say like the legit name. Samhain on October 31st also ushers in the shortest days of sunlight as the dark force triumphs. In the plant cycle, the seed is released from the old fruit and is buried underground in the depth of the dark. The evolving soul likewise distills the wisdom essence of the past cycle and intuits the visions of the future, creating seed capsules that will generate at the next new moon phase, or the next new phase of the two planets in question. The flow of energy is to withdraw deep into oneself, releasing, purifying, healing, regenerating, and preparing to be reborn. EA Glossary, Evolutionary Astrology Glossary says, attunement to the divine. Understanding oneself in the context of the divine and the corresponding expansion of consciousness, letting go of all that has come before that hinders this attunement. The beginnings of the new imaginings for a new cycle, dissolving back from whence it came. Definitely a cleaning time, but yet because of the Pisces nature, the cleaning comes from like an emotional, spiritual release, right? Of course, we want to be grounded. That fixed air Aquarian energy helps lend to objectivity so we can see clearly. Maybe it's like wearing goggles underwater. The Aquarius is like our underwater goggles to help us as we move through this all-encompassing star ocean that is Pisces energy. The balsamic phase, this is Mark Jones, the balsamic phase itself is incredibly important because anything that has occurred in the entire cycle, whatever is unfinished or incomplete relative to the original intention, that's the point of the conjunction, the original conjunction, just to be clear, will be brought to a head in this phase. In many ways, this is an archetype of frustration, as the soul remembers it has encountered so much of the process before, and yet it is still happening, still needing to be let go of. The key meaning of this phase is in a concentric expansion of consciousness, the essence of which is detachment, is engagement. Therefore, opportunities for reflection need to be created in order to bring issues to culmination. That mutable water energy doesn't necessarily want to confront all like things that can be quite daunting, or if there's fear there can be a reluctance, and yet it needs to be seen so that it can be released, or else the new phase to come, the subsequent phase, will still have corruptions within it. And this explains why evolution is a process that takes as much time as it does, right? Sometimes, and with knowledge and with awareness, we can certainly accelerate evolution. And that's the intention behind wanting to teach you about phases, is it can help as a vehicle to help accelerate evolution in a way that doesn't remove the quality of the experience and the process. But, you know, not everyone knows about these types of things. So it does explain when planets, archetypes in someone's psyche are in a balsamic phase, why they may be reluctant to accept, even though it can be a highly like psychically sensitive time, so there's a lot of insight coming through, there can be a reluctance to accept or even look at certain things that need to be looked at that need to be culminated and purified in order to release seeds into the next generation that aren't carrying, we could say, like the burdens of the father, the sins of the father, if that makes sense. So Mars and Pluto, balsamic phase, keywords again, keywords, yay, culmination, withdrawal, confusion, purification, and releasing. Synthesis of Mars and Pluto could look like this, as one example. A culmination of confusing experiences prompts one to question why they compulsively express their will as they do. Withdrawing, going within, in order to release old ways of taking action that now require purification. Very confusing time. I imagine it would be especially confusing with Mars and Pluto balsamic for some people, depending on certain dynamics going on within them. And that's not a judgment. That could be happening to anybody, right? And it could be happening for a very important reason. Sometimes we need to be confused in order to see. The confusion can actually be a vehicle to help lend clairvoyance. So yeah, again, a culmination of confusing experiences prompts one to question why they are compulsively expressing their will as they do. Withdrawing, going within in order to release old ways of taking action that now require purification, because the answers at this phase are very much going to be coming from within with sincerity, if taking a sincere approach. And yet it does bear mentioning that the answers could come from without too, but that the clarity of those answers coming from without, like in the outer world, are going to be very dependent on how connected within the individual happens to be. Okay. Venus and Saturn synthesis at balsamic phase could look like this. Withdrawing in order to purify the way one approaches limitations and self-worth relating and or their sense of aesthetics and beauty. So this could be like an artist or someone experiencing a relationship. That's why I used all those examples. Releasing the burdens, no longer serving the Venus-Saturn seed that will be born into the next cycle. As I mentioned, right? We want to release and cleanse, get rid of the sediment, get rid of the corruptions at this stage, thinking of Pisces energy being the ultimate purifier, right? And then the Aquarius energy and Pisces together, like I just think of like a practical world, real life object that could depict that, and it would be like an air purifier in a sense, right? This is very much like a purification, like purification is very important at this point, is what I'm trying to say. And it's for no reason. Those seeds want to be clean and clear of the burdens of the past so that they can continue onward in evolving the core intentions, that core agreement between the two planets, right? Without being weighed by the past. All right, so that brings us to the end of the class. Here are some resources. I'm also, like I was saying, note to self, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the NASA site where you can search asteroids to find out what their orbital period is. I'll add that to links in the description. But yeah, the Evolutionary Astrology Glossary, written by various Jeff Wolf Green EA astrologers and Jeff Wolf Green. The 8 Gates, Evolutionary Astrology and Phases, written by Mark Jones. I don't think he has that document on his website anymore, but that's where I got it from. The Lunation Cycle from Dimitra George's website. And she also has a book on this, but I got this from her website. Beautifully written. And Astrological Aspects, A Process-Oriented Approach, a book by Dean Rudyard, which I feel, although it uses the 12-phase model, like I said, if you're really jamming with these phases, you really like it, that book is going to be worth your while to read, because it not only explains the phases, it goes into aspects and explains the aspects from this process-oriented approach, this cycle-oriented approach that we've gone through today. Worth your while. I'm pretty sure that's up on Amazon. It's not like an obscure book to find, so it should be easy to get. All right, so like I said, we're at the end of class. I want to say thanks so much, Stormy Grace, for inviting me on. I'm so excited. I'm so excited to have had this chance to share for the year 2 of the YouTube Academy. You know, it's pretty cool that you're doing this, and it's pretty cool that I get to be a part of it. So thank you so much, Stormy. And this has been Planetary Phasal Relationship with me, Sarah Dehaven. My website is adeptguidance.com. And so if you're interested, check that out for sure. All right, everyone, wishing you well in your studies. If you love this, take it and run with it. It's going to serve you well. That's all for now. All right, everyone, until next time.